Okay, so today we're doing properties of elements. Now, the syllabus outcome for this lesson, it's classify the elements based on their properties and position in the periodic table through their physical properties and chemical properties. So there's some revision questions. Make sure you've done them. They're on page 47. Have a go at them before you continue. So let's go through the answers to them. So firstly, electrons are organized into shells, then orbitals. You remember the shells are basically the distance from the nucleus. So the higher the shell, the further you are away from the nucleus. Then the orbitals are the shape. So we have our S, P, D, and F. Orbitals, S being the simplest and F being the most complex. We also have the number of electrons in each. So S can hold 2, P can hold 6, D orbitals can hold 10, F orbitals can hold 14 electrons. So that's the revision. We'll move on to today's lesson. So it's mainly going to be a bit of a run through of properties, and then we'll go into a practical. So firstly, a property. A property is an attribute, a quality, or characteristic of something. Now we say an attribute or a quality, things like color, size, shape. They're all properties. With elements, there are two main types of properties that we look at, physical properties and chemical properties. So physical properties are the characteristics of matter that can be observed and measured without changing the chemical identity of the sample. So, you know, um, basically it won't change the substance as a whole. We can have a look at it, we can measure it, but it won't actually change it. Um, the physical properties that we look at its state, so state of matter, solid, liquid, gas, what type of color it is, the luster, so luster is how shiny it is. Typically something that's shiny, we say that that's lustrous. Something that's not shiny, we say it's dull, which is the opposite. Uh, Density is another one, so that's how much weight is, or how much mass per unit volume. So something with a high density will have more mass per cubic meter than something with a low density. Okay. Um, Malleability is the ability for something to basically be shaped. So typically we say metals are quite malleable. Something like lead in particular, we can just move it around and reshape it as we see fit. But something on the other end, like carbon's not very malleable. It's very brittle. It just breaks. There's also conductivity. Um, that should read conductivity. It could, and that's if it can conduct electricity or heat. Okay. Generally, the two come as one thing, but it's not necessarily. Um, they don't necessarily do come at the same time. Not everything that conducts electricity will conduct heat, but generally it does. And lastly, there's ductility, and that's the ability for something to be drawn into wires. Okay, and it does um, quite often line up with the malleability, but it's not always going to be. Now, the physical properties of an element rely on the type of element. Now, metals, so uh, anything in these groups, so your alkali metals, alkali earths, your transitions, post transitions, actinides, lanthanides, usually they're solid, they're quite lustrous, shiny, quite malleable, ductile, and they will conduct heat and electricity. On the other end, are non-metals, so anything in the group in the type nonmetals, halogens, or noble gases. They're usually a gas, could be a liquid or a solid. They're dull, brittle, they're not ductile, so you can't make wires out of them, and are electrical and heat insulators. So if you use these elements, you're not going to be able to conduct heat or conduct electricity. Now, metalloids, being what we also call semi-metals, it's kind of halfway between. So they are slightly brittle, somewhat shiny. They're usually solid at room temperature. There's something like gallium will melt at a relatively low, like it melts at body temperature, for instance. Um, but they also have chemical properties similar to those of the non-metals as well. Okay. Now, chemical property is a characteristic of a particular substance that can be observed in a chemical reaction. Okay, so it does actually end up changing um, the, the chemical makeup of the substance. One of the examples that we have previously already studied is ionization. Okay, so that's a chemical property, but it does change it from the element to the ion. It's an ionization reaction. It actually changes it chemically. Um, Yeah. And following that, some of the trends, metals tend to form positive ions, non-metals tend to form negatives. Again, it's not hard and fast rule, but that's generally the case. Um, Other chemical properties include heat of combustion, if we're burning something, enthalpy of formation. I'm not going to go into what that is, but we do cover that in Module 4. Toxicity, chemical stability, flammability, preferred oxidation states. That means, does it prefer to be a +2 charge, -2, +3, etc. The ability for something to corrode, it's also a chemical property. Combustibility, acidity, and basicity. So they're all chemical properties. Now, what we're going to do today, for the prac, we'll be observing some physical properties of several different elements. And we're going to try to determine whether they belong to metals, non-metals, or metalloids. And the key thing with that is that you're going to go in and you're going to pretend to not know what group it already belongs to. Okay, so you're going to have to actually tell me what group you think it belongs to, whether it's a metal or a non-metal, based on what you observe. Okay, so we'll move on to that prac. Other than that, that's all for today.